Last time we spoke about the invasion of Zhejiang. Chiang Kai-shek kept the momentum going by invading Zhejiang after taking Jiangxi and Fujian. However, Sunan Fang in desperation ran to an unlikely ally, Zhang Zolin, to form the National Pacification Army. Now the NPA would go to war with the NRA. The NRA also faced internal strife as strikes broke out in Guangzhou and Wuhan. After quelling the worker strikes, the NRA began to concentrate on the Zhejiang campaign, performing strategic counterattacks against Sunan Fang's offensives. By early 1927, Sunan Fang's control over Zhejiang was being undermined by the Zhejiang independence movement leaders who joined the KMT to overthrow him. Sunan Fang was served disastrous defeats. His armies began to rout, with many plundering before they fled north. Those that still continued the fight fled for Shanghai, where Sunan Fang prepared to make a last stand to hold the NRA back before Zhejiang fell. This episode is The Northern Expedition Part 4, The Taking of Shanghai and Nanking. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, over at YouTube and on all major podcast platforms. Over on the YouTube channel, I just released a full documentary on the First Sino-Japanese War. For podcasts, I've released a brand new series on the North African campaign during World War II. Also, if you have a chance, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. The NRA East Route Army had concentrated around Songjiang, just in front of Shanghai. They made it seem like they were preparing for a major assault on the super city, yet just up the Yangtze, half of the NRA were secretly preparing an offensive directed against Nanking. If the NRA captured Nanking and its strategic Tianjin-Pukou railway line, Sunan Fang's forces south of the Yangtze would be isolated and cut off from reinforcements and supplies. On February the 19th of 1927, Sunan Fang pulled his battered armies out of Zhejiang as he awaited reinforcements from Zhang Zongchang's Shandong army. Meanwhile, the KMT called upon their agents and their allies within Shanghai to foment disorder. Going all the way back to November of 1926, the KMT and CCP members within Shanghai had been assembling recruits together to strengthen their first united front. Shanghai held a large part of China's modern factory workers, numbering in the several hundreds of thousands. They represented a considerable percentage of the Shanghai population. Following the formation of the NPA, Shanghai unions began attacking Sunan Fang for bringing Shandong mercenaries into Zhejiang, and they strongly disagreed with his alliance with the Northerners. They had very real grievances with the Northerners, because they had ties to the foreign powers like the Empire of Japan. Those in Shanghai sought to break the chains of foreign imperialism, and they wanted more autonomy. From 1926 onwards, many unions, particularly those directed by the CCP, organized demonstrations against Sunan Fang and the NPA. By February of 1927, the anti-Sunan Fang movement really started to heat up. The National General Labor Union of the CCP had ordered some assassinations to terrorize the Chinese and foreign industrialists. To bring even more Shanghai workers under their influence and to hurt Sunan Fang's hold over the city, the CCP organized a political strike, similar to what had occurred in Hong Kong the year prior. A general strike in Shanghai was planned for February the 19th, and it would include the foreign concession factories. The strikers had 5 political and 12 economic demands. A major aim of the strike was to seize power through the use of the masses, even against a well-armed regime like Sunan Fang's. The CCP hoped to direct large crowds of workers against Sunan Fang's police stations and garrison posts where they could seize their weapons to arm some more worker corps. They had acquired quite a bit of experience during the Hong Kong and Guangzhou strikes when it came to arming workers, However, the response of Sun Fang's regime would be vastly different than that of the KMT in Guangzhou. Sun Fang's garrison commander at Shanghai responded violently and quickly. He dispatched broadsword-carrying executioners and soldiers throughout the city, grabbing and beheading any strikers on sight. Heads were placed on lampposts, at street corners, and on spikes all around. It is estimated perhaps 100,000 to 350,000 workers who striked. Perhaps 100 to 500 had their heads cut off. The CCP continued its efforts to attack police stations, but the general strike died out on the third day. In a form of retaliation, the Shanghai workers held a mass trial and an execution of at least one police officer. A new garrison commander was sent to Shanghai, Bi Shucheng, in an effort to reinforce the city. By the time he showed up, the CCP gave up and told the strikers to get back to work and to end the bloodshed. What became known as the Second Shanghai Uprising failed to achieve pretty much anything. Despite its failure, the Second Uprising in Shanghai displayed disunity under Sun Fang's rule. By mid-February, Sun Fang's Shanghai Navy had begun to act quite suspiciously. On the 22nd, as the CCP led sorties against the Shanghai police, shells from the warships Tiankang and Qianwei fell over the Jiangnan arsenal. Thinking not much of it, Sun Fang blamed a few young officers for the bombardment, and he gave his admiral, Yang Shichuang, a demerit. Sun Fang was, of course, reluctant at this point to penalize his subordinates for fear they might mutiny. The bombardment did not knock out the arsenal, but a fire began mysteriously on the 28th, blowing up 40 crates of artillery shells. The uprising did little to weaken Sun Fang's hold over Shanghai, so the NRA shifted their strategy. Over in Hangzhou, NRA units advanced to Sun Xiang's front, while NRA units in Jiangxi advanced downriver towards Nanking. The 6th and 7th NRA armies advanced along the Jiangxi-Anhui border as the Eastern Route Command dug in near Shanghai. Back in December, at the Nanchang Conference, Chiang Kai-shek and Borodin had managed to smooth the tensions between the CCP and the KMT. Borodin agreed to curtail some union disorder that was interfering with the war effort so that the First United Front would not collapse. However, within the new conquered territories, many that contained enormous industrial potential, strikes and labor violence kept breaking out. This, of course, was quite dangerous for the stability of the NRA as they performed the Northern Expedition. But from the CCP point of view, they were simply organizing the enormous untapped power of Chinese labor. The CCP began to really grow in power at Wuhan, and they were becoming less cooperative with Chiang Kai-shek. They believed Chiang Kai-shek was dependent and at the mercy of the Soviets. They also believed since he left Guangdong, a more malleable KMT military figure would better suit their interests. Thus, a concerted effort was made to replace Chiang Kai-shek. You could call it an anti-Chiang movement that had sprung up, and it was taking an effect in the Northern Expedition. Chiang Kai-shek had just wired the Wuhan administration 3 times for funding to pay some disgruntled 7th Army troops. The administration of Wuhan created a joint council of the party and government by insistence of Borodin, and they were generally compliant to Chiang Kai-shek's demands. One of their leaders was Shu Qian, the current Minister of Justice. According to a group close to Wang Jingwei, it seemed the CCP, Chiang Kai-shek's inner circle, and the new joint council at Wuhan between January and February of 1927 were becoming quite dependent on Soviet advice. Early in January, the CCP were attacking Chiang Kai-shek with propaganda aimed to make it seem he was in bed with other warlords and even the Japanese, thus a betrayer to Dr. Sun Yat-sen's movement. Shu Qian, who was the current commander of the 8th NRA Army, became a potential replacement for Chiang Kai-shek, but the CCP were still afraid to risk open strife with the KMT. Borodin and the CCP leaders like Mao Zedong were encouraged by the CCP membership's growth in the countryside and within the military units around Wuhan. As the NRA advanced through Hunan, CCP membership increased as they spread through the peasant associations. It was a similar case in Hubei. The Hunanese commander of the 2nd NRA Army brought up the issue at a KMT meeting, warning all of his colleagues not to neglect the dangers of internal strife. Many of our members have become sidetracked by ideas, not indicated in Sun Yat-sen's instructions, not to belittle the enemy. Our enemies are now uniting together and gathering to attack us. We should concentrate the power of the party and obey its orders strictly, regardless of our own opinions. Chiang Kai-shek, of course, was not oblivious to the danger all around him. He launched his own sort of counterattacks. He began claiming the CCP strategy, and those who were following them, threatened the all-class union of the KMT. On February the 19th, he urged a KMT audience during a speech to, quote, "Look to the doctrines of Sun Yat-sen and nothing else." The anti-Chiang Kai-shek sentiment was felt in crowds at Wuhan. On February the 24th, a crowd of 50,000 assembled at the party HQ parade grounds, where they made fiery speeches against Chiang Kai-shek and against the Northern Expedition. These are the types of things you could hear in the crowd. "All we have seen is military power, but no party power. Individual will, but not party will. Old degenerate counter-revolutionaries have caused these pathetic facts of the party. This is why we must knock down the feudal influences." After this, several people began chanting, "Down with the old and degenerate." Then a single man in the crowd made a speech stating, "A few individuals could not do the work. Now the old, rotten feudal thinking members manipulate the KMT. We must therefore knock them down." After this, the chant turned to, "Down with Chiang Kai-shek. Oppose the military dictatorship." Then the head of the NRA's political department, Tong Yen-ta, stated, "Democratic centralization was the way to achieve the ideals of the Three People's Principles, but now our leadership has been occupied by the old, ignorant, and the incompetent. We must overthrow personal dictatorship and bring the military under control." Chiang Kai-shek was enraged by all of this, of course, and he refuted the charges made against him. He singled out Xu Chen, who had made himself chairman of the new Joint Council without KMT party authorization. Chiang Kai-shek began a little investigation, and he concluded it was Borodin's doing, so he telegrammed Moscow on February the 26th, requesting Borodin be sent back to the USSR. The next day at a KMT meeting, Chiang Kai-shek told his colleagues he felt despite the fact the NRA advanced into new territories, while the people saw them as KMT members, they only heard propaganda from the CCP. By March, the anti-Chiang cabal now sought to replace him with General Tang Xingzhi, the Huinese defector made commander of the 8th NRA Army. According to one Soviet report written on the 5th of March, Tang Xingzhi was seen to be much more dependent on Soviet aid, and a lot more cooperative in helping the anti-Chiang effort amongst the other generals. A new anti-Chiang alliance would require the support of other high-ranking generals such as Zhang Fangkuai's New Corps, Chen Mingshu's 11th Army, Chu Beitei's 3rd Army, and the 9th and 10th Armies. According to the same Soviet report, Tang Xingzhi managed to turn Li Zongren against Chiang Kai-shek, and this hampered Chiang Kai-shek's ability to obtain funds from Wuhan to pay Li Zongren's 7th Army. Spring of 1927 brought more disunity to the First United Front, and thus it hurt the Northern Expedition. Although the NRA was clearly on a roll in Zhejiang and Fujian, their progress north of Wuhan and downriver from Jiangxi lost steam. Chiang Kai-shek still held confidence in the men of the Eastern Route Army concentrating along the Jiangsu-Anhui border, but their offensive was also halted. In southern Henan, where the NRA were facing remnants of Wu Peifu's army, winter's chill was beginning to slow down the expedition. The offensive kicked back up with a bunch of defections among Sun Fang's forces in Anhui. Chen Taoyuan, Sun Fang's commander-in-chief for the Anhui forces, had become dissatisfied with him and how he was ruling his 5-provincial empire, which I guess was now more like 2. Chen Taoyuan was demoralized, and who could blame him? Back on December the 5th of 1926, Chen Taoyuan began secret negotiations by dispatching some of his subordinates, such as Fan Shaokai, over to the KMT, hoping to defect and gain a decent position. Simultaneously, Sun Fang maintained hopes of holding his front line in Anhui by promoting subordinates. Sun Fang appointed Chen Taoyuan to be the director of defenses over the province on December the 21st. On February the 20th of 1927, one of Chen Taoyuan's divisions, led by Liao Paozi, defected to the NRA when he was guarding a strategic pass known as the Qimen Gateway. This was a 5,000-foot-high range leading into Anhui. Now the NRA held a mountainside door leading directly into the province. The mountain range in question also happened to be the last natural barrier that Sun Fang's troops were utilizing to defend the lower Yangtze area, including, of course, Shanghai. After that, Chen Taoyuan tossed the towel and just gave in to the inevitable. He defected to the NRA. Chen Taoyuan proved his defection by turning his defensive sector along the Yangtze over on March 2nd. He brought with him the mixed brigade of Wang Bu and elements of the Hunan army led by Yue Kaixin. The NRA proceeded to advance over the Yellow Mountain and down it to seize Taiping in Anhui on March 3rd. Pretty much unopposed, the NRA marched upon Nanking through Anhui, taking several routes. By March 17th, the 17th Division of Cheng Chen's 6th NRA Army had advanced 200 miles downstream using river steamboats and was only 70 miles away from Nanking. Over the north banks of the Yangtze, the NRA formed a spearhead and thrusted it into the soft midsection of the North-South Railway. By mid-March, the NRA captured Hefei in northern Anhui, and at this point, Sun Fang's relationship with his navy was greatly waning, as he was becoming more and more dependent on the Tsingpu Railway as an escape option to head north rather than via the sea. Thus, in March of 1927, this would see the NRA effectively begin trapping Sun Fang into the Yangtze Delta around Shanghai. The NRA southern forces were now advancing out of Zhejiang into the Delta region. One pincer was heading north along the shores of Lake Tai, aiming at the Shanghai Nanking Railway at Changzhou. Meanwhile, in Anhui, the 6th Army was attacking Wuhu on the 6th of March. As anti-foreign disorder broke out at Wuhu, the NRA political agents rallied crowds of civilians and soldiers to mob the foreigners of their marine customs offices and clubhouses. This sent the foreigners to flee downriver to Shanghai by ship, carrying more tales of anti-foreign abuse with them. The Eastern Route force facing Shanghai was met with heavy artillery bombardment as more and more MPA troops from Shandong began to arrive. Several NRA attacks north of Shanghai against the railway links were made, threatening the city's defensive capabilities. By mid-March, many forces defending Shanghai began evacuating for Nanking. March 15th, the Eastern Route Army had its first major breakthrough over the hills that overlooked Lake Tai. NRA forces managed to outflank the enemy artillery placements and erected a real blockade by March 16th. Now a new NRA pincer moved west against Li Shui, 40 miles from Nanking. Along the east shore of said lake, the NRA was effectively blocked by Shandong troops who held an advantage in heavy artillery. By mid-March, many Shandong reinforcements arrived at Changzhou along the Nanking-Shanghai Railway, but they were simply turned back to Nanking. Was not a good look. From Wuhu, the NRA kept the advance towards Tongde, which was outflanked and captured on the 17th. While the East Route force took up a position 50 miles from Nanking on some ridges where Sun Fang had once headquartered. On the 18th, north of the Yangtze, the 7th NRA Army had just captured Hefei and its railway link. The Delta area's defenses were falling apart everywhere one looked. The dog-meat general took one look and he ordered a general withdrawal of all the Shandong forces from the Shanghai area to some positions north of the Yangtze. With that, Shanghai's defenses pretty much fell apart. Over at the Songjiang front, the forces of Bi Shucheng retreated into the city towards the railway station, but did not hightail it to Nanking despite being ordered to do so. According to foreign and Chinese journalists, Bi Shucheng had been waiting for the opportune moment to defect to the NRA, and he had been secretly negotiating to turn Shanghai over. Thus it seemed the NRA had managed to capture the city without provoking the foreigners. On the 20th, the NRA managed to flank the railroad artillery position still manned by some White Russian forces. They managed this through more defections, this time from the Shanghai police. The Shanghai police controlled the waterways and they aided the NRA in navigating them so that they could advance more rapidly. Simultaneously, Suzhou, Changzhou, and Honglin were captured. Sun Fang was receiving zero aid from the sea, and for over a week by this point, Admiral Yang Shichang had taken the fleet upriver to join the NRA's river fleet. Of course, Admiral Yang Shuchang's defection had been in the works for well over a year, and his timing could not have been worse for Sun Fang. On March 21st, a bloodless seizure of Shanghai proceeded. Now, going back to our conversation about the anti-Chiang Kai-shek movement, there had been a lot of development during this time period. In January of 1927, Wang Jingwei, with his left-wing allies, members of the CCP and Borodin, had transferred the seat of the KMT government from Guangzhou to Wuhan. On March the 1st, the KMT government then reorganized the military commission and placed Chiang Kai-shek under its jurisdiction with the secret intent to arrest him. As the NRA was about to storm Shanghai, a major opportunity presented itself to the CCP. Most of the northern Chinese defenders still stuck in Shanghai were simply looking to surrender. Thus, on March 21st, CCP leaders Zhou Enlai and Chen Duxiu launched an armed uprising. The CCP seized weapons, created a general strike, and seized most of the city. This caused many of Sunan Fang's soldiers to flee to the railway station or coasts, looting as they did. Major battles took place between armed workers and soldiers, causing fires and damage to the heavily populated areas of the city. For example, in the northern suburb of Jiaibei, armed workers burnt down 3,000 homes. By the night of the 22nd, Bai Qiangxi's NRA troops were gradually occupying the city. However, the general strike was disrupting their efforts. General Bai Qiangxi ordered the CCP to call the general strike off on the 24th, but for over 4 days, 322 Chinese were killed and over 2,000 were wounded. As the NRA consolidated their authority within the city, their top spokesmen, Chiang Kai-shek, Ho Ying-qin, and Bai Chongxi, tried to alleviate the foreign community, who were ridden with frightened refugees in the international settlement. The settlement was a literal war zone, fitted with barbed wire, gates, marines, and soldiers behind sandbag trenches and such. Very real and many false stories were spread of anti-foreign atrocities. The NRA put out notices stating, "The purpose of the military operations of the Northern Expedition is to establish a nation governed by the people and to get rid of warlords. Our army occupied Hunan, Jiangxi, Hubei, Fujian, Zhejiang, Anhui, and other provinces, and the unification of the entire nation will be accomplished soon. The party's army's success is the victory of the people. In accordance with international morality, we shall guard the lives and property of foreigners. We have occupied Shanghai by more than force. We request that consuls inform your nationals to carry on your activities as usual, and order the Marines not to misunderstand our motives, and not to carry out means to obstruct our revolutionary cause." And now we have come to a large and confusing part of the story. At Nanking and Shanghai, major events would unfold, seeing the end of the First United Front. After a few days, anti-foreign actions would follow the capture of Nanking, requiring more and more public assurances from the KMT. The last demoralized rearguard crossed the Yangtze to get to the safer northern banks. By doing this, now the NPA's most southern position was the rail terminal at Pukou. The NRA vanguard entered Nanking on March 24th with units of the 6th Army and countless NPA Anhui defectors alongside them. Chiang Kai-shek loyalists in the KMT then charged the head of the 6th NRA Army's political department, a CCP member named Lin Shuhan, with masterminding attacks upon foreigners. These attacks provoked the foreign powers to then attack Chiang Kai-shek, diverting his attention from the Northern Expedition and weakening his authority over the new Wuhan government. Elements of the 6th Army had stirred up anti-foreign attitudes amongst their troops and civilians within Nanking. Yet the foreign community in the city would go on to say the attacks they witnessed were not made by civilian mobs. Whatever motivations, the situation that unfolded at Nanking signified a giant breach of soldier discipline. For Chiang Kai-shek to have permitted such actions to take place was inconsistent with his strategy of avoiding any provocation upon the foreign powers. Yet over 25,000 Nanking refugees flooded over to Shanghai, as 25,000 foreign Marines and soldiers began defending the concessions, assuring the NRA they would be ready for a fight. Going back in time somewhat, the March 20th coup was something akin to a patient zero. Back on January the 3rd of 1927, elements of the KMT at Wuhan had triggered mobs to attack the British concessions until they gave up some authority at Hankow and Kukang to the Chinese. Yet the KMT had never given such orders to do so. It seemed the CCP were pushing these actions. Between March the 7th to the 17th, the new Joint Council at Wuhan was openly being defiant towards Chiang Kai-shek, and they held their first plenary session to work against him. They met with the KMT leftists and CCP members and agreed to appoint CCP members Su Xiaocheng and Tan Pingshan as ministers. promoted CCP peasant and labor groups, and dispatched 3 representatives to the Third Communist International to discuss China's role in the World Revolution. It did not seem the CCP intended to keep their promise to the KMT about China not going communist. All of this authority at Wuhan undermined Chiang Kai-shek's authority and those loyal to him. They immediately voted to take direct control of military funding, which had been previously handled by the Minister of Finance, TV Sung, obviously considered a loyal supporter to Chiang Kai-shek. In order to gain more influence in the NRA, the Wuhan guys began creating a parallel military chain of command and recruited CCP members into major officer positions. They hoped such actions would see more military types defect over to their cause. Now by this point, the NRA really had become a giant beast. When the Northern Expedition launched in July of 1926, there were 8 armies. By March of 1927, there were 40. Wuhan's fiscal and political control over said armies would clearly undermine and probably be capable of getting rid of Chiang Kai-shek, so it was a no-brainer to attempt seizing them for the CCP. The Wuhan cabal hoped to incorporate some of these new armies, made mostly of defectors, whose alliances were probably flimsy to be under their control. Chiang Kai-shek tried to counter these attacks, but anything he did would be seen as censorship or anti-communist, thus shattering the First United Front, from which he did still depend on. Or did he? Now technically the Wuhan cabal was only able to do what they were doing because leading KMT figures were not present, such as Chiang Kai-shek or Wang Jingwei. Thus lesser members like Xu Chen and Tang Yantai were able to make some big decisions. Both men were CCP aligned and they worked to abolish Chiang Kai-shek's posts that he had held, such as the Ministry of the Military, which was replaced by the Wuhan Military Council. The Wuhan cabal was able to reduce Chiang Kai-shek's role as commander-in-chief, and they gave various tasks that he had control over to other military commanders. Likewise, the military education programs at the KMT academies removed Chiang Kai-shek's supervisory role, depriving him of obtaining the loyalty of the new junior officer corps. Appointments, promotions, and dismissals of commanders would be done by the military council, i.e., Xu Chen and Tang Yantai. They first relieved Chiang Meng-shu, a known Chiang Kai-shek loyalist, and they replaced him with a Moscow-certified star, Tang Cheng-chi. It became very obvious what they were trying to do. Thus, as the Wuhan cabal tore apart Chiang Kai-shek's authority piece by piece, the NRA's war against Wu Peifu and Sunan Fang began to collapse. Without a high degree of coordination and leadership, the NRA was finding it difficult to fight the numerically superior NPA forces. In March of 1927, Wuhan proclaimed all regulations ordered by Chiang Kai-shek's HQ to be nullified. This meant although he retained authority over troops at the front lines, Wuhan now claimed authority over all the other troops. All these attacks upon Chiang Kai-shek caused massive confusion amongst the ranks. Many within the KMT believed, and rightfully so, that the CCP was simply trying to take leadership over the movement. As the Northern Expedition took the NRA into Jiangsu, the momentum of their previous victories had pushed them across the Yangtze. This was heavily aided by the recent Shanghai naval defectors, who eased the crossings using their vessels. Those already operating north of the Yangtze, such as the 3rd, 7th, and 10th Armies, were pressing past Hefei towards Pengpu by early April. Pengpu was the capital of Anhui, forming a sort of bridgehead over the Hui River, with a railway depot for Jiang Zongcheng's armies. Thus, its capture would open a door to the invasion of northern China. Yet the NRA's momentum died in confusion over which direction they were to take, because of the Wuhan cabal Chiang Kai-shek fighting, and their logistical support was simply falling apart. It seemed to all like the Northern Expedition might never make it north. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, over at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. Over on the YouTube channel, I just released a new long-form documentary on the First Sino-Japanese War. And as for podcasts, I have a brand new series on the North African campaign during World War II. Also, if you have a chance, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for what we'll tackle next. The NRA managed to seize the super cities of Shanghai and Nanking. The NRA now dominated most of South China, and they were about to begin invading the north, when internal problems arose. The CCP and Chiang Kai-shek were not seeing eye to eye, and now a civil war seemed to be breaking out in the First United Front.